The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the concentration camp at Dachau on April 29, 1945. American soldiers of the 45th Infantry Division and elements of the 42nd Infantry Division had just broken through the gates of one of Nazi Germany's most notorious death camps. What they found inside would shake them to their core. Skeletal figures in striped uniforms, barely alive, stared at them with hollow eyes. Bodies stacked like cordwood-filled railway cars. The smell of death hung thick in the air. These battle-hardened men, who had fought their way across North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and France, had never seen anything like this. Within hours, something would happen that the United States Army would spend decades trying to hide. American soldiers would execute hundreds of German prisoners of war in cold blood, and the military justice system would look the other way. This is not a story the American military wanted told. For years, the official narrative of World War II painted the Allied forces as unblemished liberators who fought with honor against an evil empire. The reality was far more complex. What happened at Dachau, at Biscari in Sicily, and at other locations across the European theater reveals a darker truth about war, about human nature under extreme stress, and about the uncomfortable fact that even the righteous can commit atrocities. These were not isolated incidents carried out by rogue soldiers. These were systematic killings involving dozens of men, witnessed by hundreds, and quietly buried by a chain of command that decided some truths were too damaging to acknowledge. The story begins not at Dachau but 2 years earlier on the hot, dusty plains of Sicily in July 1943. The Allied invasion of Sicily, codenamed Operation Husky, marked the first major offensive against Axis forces in Europe. American troops were facing combat against hardened German and Italian soldiers for the first time on European soil. The fighting was brutal. Temperatures soared above 100 degrees. Water was scarce. Men dropped from heat exhaustion as often as from enemy fire. The 45th Infantry Division, a National Guard unit drawn largely from Oklahoma, New Mexico, Arizona, and Colorado, found itself in heavy combat near the Biscari airfield on July 14, 1943. Captain John Compton commanded C Company of the 180th Infantry Regiment. His men had been fighting for days with little sleep and constant casualties. They had taken heavy fire from Italian and German positions. Some of the enemy soldiers had pretended to surrender, only to open fire when American troops approached. This tactic, whether real or perceived, had cost American lives and fueled a burning rage among the soldiers. On the morning of July 14th, Compton's company overran an enemy position and captured 76 Italian soldiers and German SS troops. These men had surrendered, thrown down their weapons, and raised their hands. Under the Geneva Conventions, they were entitled to protection as prisoners of war. Instead, Compton ordered them lined up. He told his men to execute them. Machine gun fire ripped through the group of prisoners. Some tried to run. They were shot in the back. When the firing stopped, 76 men lay dead in the Sicilian dirt. That same day, just a few miles away, Sergeant Horace West of the same division faced a similar situation. West and his platoon had captured 45 Italian soldiers. He was ordered to escort them to the rear for processing. West, a career soldier who had served in the army for years, made a decision. He later claimed he believed his orders were to kill the prisoners, though no such orders were ever proven to exist. West marched the prisoners to a ravine, lined them up, and opened fire with his Thompson submachine gun. He methodically shot each man. When survivors tried to crawl away, he walked among them and finished them off with single shots to the head. 37 men died. 8 survived by playing dead under the bodies of their comrades. Unlike what would happen later at Dachau, the Biscari massacres did not remain hidden. The survivors reported what happened. Military police investigated. Both Compton and West faced courts-martial, the first American soldiers charged with war crimes against enemy prisoners in World War II. The trials revealed the immense pressure these men were under, and the atmosphere of rage that permeated the combat zones. Multiple witnesses testified that General George Patton, commanding the 7th Army, had given speeches before the invasion, urging soldiers to kill the enemy without mercy, to take no prisoners when it would slow down the advance. Patton had told his troops that the enemy was treacherous, that they would feign surrender and then attack. He had, according to testimony, created an environment where murdering prisoners seemed acceptable, even encouraged. Captain Compton was acquitted. The court-martial board, composed of his fellow officers, accepted his defense, that he believed he was following Patton's orders. The message was clear. Killing prisoners might be against the rules, but in the heat of combat, with the right justification, it could be forgiven. Sergeant West was convicted, but his sentence was mild by any standard. He received life imprisonment, but this was quickly reduced, and he was returned to duty. He would die in combat just months later. War crimes would be prosecuted, but not too vigorously. The needs of maintaining morale and the reputation of American forces took precedence over strict adherence to the laws of war. The Biscari massacres should have served as a warning. They should have led to clear directives, strict enforcement of the Geneva Conventions, and serious consequences for violations. Instead, they were quietly swept aside. The official reports were classified. The soldiers involved were portrayed as having acted under extreme stress. The army moved on, and the precedent was set. When soldiers encountered atrocities, when they witnessed the depths of enemy depravity, the rules could bend. Justice could be flexible. Some enemies, it seemed, deserved death, even after surrender. 2 years later, the war in Europe was entering its final phase. Germany was collapsing. Allied forces were pushing in from the east and west. The true scale of Nazi atrocities was becoming apparent. As American forces advanced through Germany in early 1945, they began liberating concentration camps. These were not prisoner-of-war camps. These were death factories, places where the Nazi regime had systematically murdered millions of Jews, Roma, homosexuals, political prisoners, and others deemed undesirable. The soldiers who liberated these camps were utterly unprepared for what they found. The 42nd Infantry Division, known as the Rainbow Division, and the 45th Infantry Division, which had fought at Biscari, were racing toward Munich in late April 1945. On April 29th, elements of both divisions converged on Dachau, one of the first and longest operating concentration camps in Nazi Germany. Dachau had been operating since 1933. More than 200,000 people had been imprisoned there. At least 1,500 had been murdered, though the true number was likely much higher. The camp had become a training ground for SS concentration camp guards. It was where the Nazis had perfected their techniques of dehumanization, torture, and mass murder. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks commanded the 3rd Battalion of the 157th Infantry Regiment, 45th Division. His men approached Dachau from the south. As they neared the camp, they encountered a sight that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. A train of railway cars sat on a siding leading into the camp. Curious, the soldiers opened the doors. Inside were the bodies of approximately 2,000 prisoners, stacked and tangled together. These were prisoners who had been evacuated from other camps as the Allies advanced. The Nazis had loaded them into these cars without food or water and left them to die. Some had been dead for days. Others had died just hours before. A few were still barely alive, skeletal hands reaching out weakly. The soldiers who opened those railway cars were changed forever. Many vomited. Some broke down crying. Others stood in shocked silence. These were men who had seen combat for years, who had watched friends die, who had killed enemy soldiers in battle. But this was different. This was industrial murder. This was evil on a scale they could not have imagined, and their rage began to build. As Sparks and his men moved toward the main camp, they began encountering SS guards. Some were trying to flee. Others were still at their posts, uncertain what to do as the Americans approached. The first confrontations were standard combat. The SS guards fired. The Americans fired back. Guards were killed. But as more Americans entered the camp and saw the conditions, saw the emaciated prisoners, saw the bodies piled in corners, saw the crematoria still warm with the ashes of the recently murdered, something fundamental changed. The rules of war, already strained, began to collapse entirely. Prisoners in striped uniforms pressed against the barbed wire fences, shouting and pointing at the SS guards, who were trying to blend in or hide. The Americans began rounding up the guards, ordering them to put their hands up and line up against walls. Some guards surrendered immediately, relieved to be captured by Americans rather than Soviet forces. They had heard that the Americans treated prisoners well, that they followed the rules. They believed they would be processed, sent to POW camps, and eventually returned home when the war ended. They were wrong. What happened next is where the accounts begin to diverge, and where the truth becomes difficult to establish with absolute certainty. Multiple witnesses, both American soldiers and liberated prisoners, describe scenes of summary executions. SS guards were lined up against walls and shot. Guards who had already surrendered were executed where they stood. American soldiers fired into groups of German prisoners with rifles and machine guns. In some accounts, liberated prisoners joined in, beating SS guards to death with shovels, clubs, and their bare hands, while American soldiers watched or participated. Lieutenant Colonel Sparks himself witnessed and tried to stop some of the killings. He later testified that he saw American soldiers lined up approximately 50 German prisoners along a wall and opened fire with a machine gun. Sparks ran to the machine gun and kicked it over, stopping the execution. He ordered his men to cease fire and take the remaining Germans into custody. But Sparks was one officer trying to control hundreds of men spread across a large camp complex. His orders could not reach everyone, and many soldiers, having seen the railway cars and the condition of the camp, were not inclined to follow orders to spare SS guards. The number of German prisoners killed at Dachau has been debated for decades. The official U.S. Army investigation concluded that approximately 30 to 50 SS guards were killed after surrendering. Other estimates, based on witness testimony and German records, suggest the number was much higher, possibly several hundred. Some historians have argued the number could have been as high as 500, though this remains controversial and difficult to verify. What is not in dispute is that American soldiers killed German prisoners who had surrendered and posed no threat. These were not combat deaths. These were executions. The chaos at Dachau was compounded by the presence of two different American divisions, unclear command structures, and the involvement of liberated prisoners in the violence. The 42nd Division arrived at roughly the same time as elements of the 45th Division, leading to confusion about who was in charge. Brigadier General Henning Linden of the 42nd Division and officers from the 45th Division and officers from the 45th Division would later dispute who actually liberated the camp, a controversy that obscured the more serious question of what happened to the prisoners. As news of the killings spread up the chain of command, senior officers faced a dilemma. Courts-martial like those at Biscari would mean public trials, extensive press coverage, and a black mark on the reputation of American forces just as the war was ending. The American public, learning about the Holocaust for the first time, might not be sympathetic to prosecuting soldiers who killed concentration camp guards. The military decided to investigate but not to prosecute vigorously. Lieutenant General Alexander Patch, commanding the 7th Army, ordered an investigation. The job fell to Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Whitaker, the 7th Army's Assistant Inspector General. Whitaker conducted a thorough investigation, interviewing dozens of witnesses and compiling a detailed report. His findings were damning. He confirmed that American soldiers had killed German prisoners after they had surrendered. He identified specific units and, in some cases, specific soldiers involved in the killings. He recommended courts-martial. But Whitaker's report was classified immediately. General Patton reviewed it and made a decision. He wrote that while the killings were technically violations of the laws of war, they occurred under extraordinary circumstances. The soldiers had been confronted with atrocities that exceeded anything in their experience. They had acted in the heat of passion. Patton decided that courts-martial would not serve the interests of justice or the army. He recommended that no charges be filed. His superiors agreed. The report was buried in classified files, where it would remain for decades. Some officers did face administrative consequences. Lieutenant Colonel Sparks, who had actually tried to stop some of the killings, was investigated but cleared. Other officers received reprimands that were placed in their files but not made public. No one was court-martialed. No one went to prison. The message was clear. The military would investigate to satisfy the requirements of military law, but it would not punish soldiers for killing SS guards at a death camp. The decision to cover up the Dachau killings set a precedent that extended beyond that single incident. Reports began filtering in of other summary executions at other camps. When the 11th Armored Division liberated Mauthausen-Gusen concentration camp in Austria, there were similar reports of SS guards being killed after surrender. At Flossenburg, at Buchenwald, at smaller camps and sub-camps across Germany, American soldiers sometimes took justice into their own hands when confronted with the evidence of Nazi atrocities. Each time the military investigated quietly and decided prosecution was not warranted. The psychological impact on the soldiers involved was profound and lasting. Many of the men who participated in or witnessed the killings at Dachau never spoke of it publicly. Some felt justified, believing the SS guards deserved death for their crimes. Others felt guilt and shame, knowing they had violated the principles they believed they were fighting for. Still others simply tried to forget, to put the war behind them, and move on with their lives. When pressed, many would say that anyone who had seen what they saw, who had opened those railway cars or walked through that camp, would understand why they did what they did. The liberated prisoners had mixed reactions to the killings. Some felt satisfaction watching their tormentors executed. These men had suffered unimaginable cruelty at the hands of the SS. They had watched friends and family murdered. They had been starved, beaten, and brutalized. Seeing their guards killed was, for some, a form of justice. Other prisoners were disturbed by the violence, fearing it made the Americans no better than the Nazis. Still others were simply too weak, too traumatized, to process what was happening around them. They focused on survival, on the fact that they were free, that the nightmare was over. The German prisoners who survived the initial violence at Dachau were eventually processed and sent to POW camps. Some were later tried for war crimes. The commanders of Dachau and other concentration camps faced justice at the Dachau trials, a series of war crimes tribunals held by the U.S. Army. Dozens of SS guards and camp officials were convicted and executed, or imprisoned. The legal proceedings were meticulous and followed established rules of evidence and procedure. The contrast with the summary executions on Liberation Day could not have been starker. Some SS guards died without trial, killed in moments of rage. Others received trials and were executed after due process. The difference was timing and the restoration of military discipline once the initial shock had passed. The cover-up extended to the press and public information. Journalists who arrived at Dachau shortly after liberation heard rumors of the killings, but could not confirm them. The military controlled access to witnesses and documents. The official story emphasized the liberation, the horrors of the camp, and the joy of the freed prisoners. Any mention of American soldiers killing prisoners was quickly suppressed. Reporters who asked too many questions found themselves denied access or reassigned. The narrative had to be clean. Americans were liberators, not executioners. The public could not be allowed to think otherwise, especially with the war still ongoing in the Pacific. This same pattern of cover-up extended to the Biscari massacres. While Compton and West had been tried, the details of those trials were not widely publicized. The testimony about Patton's speeches, about the atmosphere that encouraged killing prisoners, was classified. Patton himself faced no consequences. He was too valuable, too famous, too successful. He went on to command the Third Army in some of the most important operations of the war. His reputation as a brilliant if controversial commander remained intact. The fact that his rhetoric may have contributed to war crimes was buried in classified files. The institutional decision to cover up these incidents reflected broader concerns within the military establishment. The United States was positioning itself as the moral leader of the post-war world. The United Nations was being formed. War crimes tribunals were being planned for major Nazi and Japanese leaders. The Americans needed to maintain the moral high ground. Admitting that American soldiers had committed atrocities, even on a smaller scale than the Axis powers, would undermine that position. It would give ammunition to critics and enemies. It would complicate the narrative of good versus evil that had sustained public support for the war. But the cover-up came at a cost. It meant that lessons were not learned. It meant that the military did not fully grapple with the question of how to prevent atrocities by its own forces. It meant that soldiers learned they could get away with war crimes under certain circumstances. And it meant that the historical record was incomplete and distorted. For decades, the official history of the liberation of Dachau made no mention of the killings. Textbooks described the joy of liberation without the bloodshed. Veterans kept silent, either from guilt, or from loyalty to their comrades, or from a belief that civilians would never understand. The truth began to emerge slowly. Decades later, in the 1980s and 1990s, as classified documents were gradually declassified, and as veterans began to speak more openly as they aged, the full story started to come out. Historians gained access to the Whitaker report and other Army investigations. Journalists interviewed veterans who were willing to talk. Survivors of Dachau shared their memories. Academic studies examined the incidents in detail. The comfortable narrative of unblemished American conduct in World War II began to crack. The revelations sparked intense debate. Some argued that the soldiers were justified, that SS guards who had participated in genocide did not deserve the protection of the Geneva Conventions. They pointed out that these same guards would likely have been convicted and executed at war crimes trials anyway, so their summary execution simply bypassed a formality. Others argued that the rule of law must apply equally to everyone, that civilized nations do not engage in revenge killings, and that allowing atrocities even against atrocious people undermines the very principles America claimed to be fighting for. The debate also touched on questions of accountability and command responsibility. If Patton's speeches at Biscari contributed to an atmosphere where killing prisoners seemed acceptable, should he have faced consequences? If senior officers at Dachau failed to control their troops or chose to look the other way, should they have been held accountable? The Army's position had been that the extreme circumstances excused the violations, but this reasoning was troubling. It suggested that there were situations where the laws of war did not apply, where passion and rage could override legal and moral obligations. Modern military training has incorporated these lessons, though often without explicitly referencing the incidents at Biscari or Dachau. Soldiers are now given extensive training on the laws of war, on the treatment of prisoners, and on the legal and moral obligations that apply even in extreme circumstances. The military has recognized that atrocities by its own forces undermine mission success, damage national credibility, and can turn populations against American forces. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan saw renewed emphasis on proper treatment of prisoners, though violations still occurred, most notoriously at Abu Ghraib prison. The psychological dimensions of what happened at Dachau deserve careful consideration. The soldiers who liberated the camp were not sadists or naturally cruel men. They were ordinary Americans, many of them draftees, who had been fighting for years, They had been trained to kill the enemy, but also to follow rules, to respect the laws of war, to be better than their opponents. When they encountered Dachau, when they saw evidence of systematic murder on an industrial scale, something broke. The cognitive dissonance was too great. These SS guards, many of them young men not so different in age from the American soldiers, had participated in or at least enabled the murder of thousands. They had worked in a death factory. They had guarded prisoners they knew were being starved and murdered. And now they wanted to surrender and receive the protection of the Geneva Conventions they had so thoroughly violated. For the American soldiers, this seemed obscene. These men had forfeited any claim to decent treatment by their actions. The normal rules could not apply. And so, in the heat of the moment, with the smell of death in the air and the sight of skeletal prisoners all around them, the soldiers decided to dispense justice themselves. They were judge, jury, and executioner. It took only seconds to make these decisions. A trigger pulled, a burst of machine gun fire, and men who moments before had been prisoners of war were corpses. Lieutenant Colonel Sparks, who tried to stop some of the killings, later described the scene as one of utter chaos. Men were crying, vomiting, and shouting. Guards were begging for mercy in German, a language most Americans did not understand. The normal chain of command had broken down. Officers were trying to establish order, to secure the camp, to care for the thousands of liberated prisoners who needed immediate medical attention. In the midst of this chaos, executions were taking place. Some were almost casual, a guard against a wall, a single shot. Others were more organized, groups of prisoners lined up and machine-gunned. There was no consistency, no plan. It was spontaneous violence born of rage and horror. The involvement of liberated prisoners in some of the violence added another layer of complexity. These prisoners had every reason to hate their captors. They had suffered enormously. Many had lost their entire families. They had been brutalized day after day. When liberation came and they saw their guards vulnerable for the first time, some took revenge. American soldiers sometimes stood by and let it happen, or even encouraged it. In some cases, soldiers gave liberated prisoners weapons or tools. In other cases, they simply did not intervene as prisoners beat guards to death. This raised difficult questions about culpability. Were the Americans responsible for murders committed by liberated prisoners? Were they obligated to protect even SS guards from mob violence? The legal framework was clear, even if the emotions were not. Under the Geneva Conventions and the laws of war, prisoners must be protected from violence, including from civilians seeking revenge. The capturing power has an obligation to ensure their safety. American soldiers who allowed or encouraged prisoners to kill guards were violating this obligation. But enforcing this rule, in the immediate aftermath of discovering Dachau, was asking men to suppress their most basic human emotions to protect people they viewed as monsters, while surrounded by evidence of monstrous crimes. It was asking more than many soldiers could give. The cover-up also involved a degree of intimidation and pressure on potential witnesses. Soldiers who might have testified about the killings were warned, sometimes subtly and sometimes explicitly, to keep quiet. They were told that going public would harm the reputation of their unit, would dishonor their fallen comrades, would give comfort to the enemy. In the tight-knit military culture, where loyalty to one's unit and one's fellow soldiers was paramount, this was powerful pressure. Speaking out meant betraying your brothers in arms. It meant being labeled a troublemaker or worse. Most soldiers chose silence. Some officers who wanted to pursue justice found their careers subtly damaged. They were passed over for promotions, given poor assignments, or eased out of the military. The message was clear. The institution did not want this pursued. Those who insisted on pursuing it would pay a price. This pattern of punishing whistleblowers and protecting the institution would repeat itself in future conflicts. the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, the abuse at Abu Ghraib in Iraq. These later incidents followed similar patterns: initial cover-ups, reluctant investigations, attempts to limit accountability to low-ranking individuals while protecting the chain of command. The number 500 in the question asked appears to be an estimate or claim from various sources over the years about the total number of German prisoners who may have been killed in revenge killings at liberation, while the official army investigation of Dachau concluded the number was much lower, around 30 to 50. Other witnesses and historians have suggested higher numbers. At Dachau specifically, some estimates have ranged up to several hundred. When combined with incidents at other camps and other locations during the final weeks of the war, the total number of German prisoners killed in revenge killings by American forces could potentially have reached several hundred. However, the exact number remains disputed and difficult to verify with certainty. What is not disputed is the systematic cover-up. At multiple levels of command, from battalion to army to the Pentagon, decisions were made to minimize, hide, or explain away these incidents. Documents were classified. Investigations were limited in scope. Recommendations for prosecution were rejected. Public statements emphasized liberation and heroism, while omitting the revenge killings. This was not a conspiracy in the sense of a secret cabal meeting in a smoke-filled room. It was an institutional decision, made at multiple points by multiple people, that the reputation of the military and the morale of the troops was more important than strict accountability for war crimes. The contrast with how the Allies prosecuted German war crimes is striking. The Nuremberg trials and other war crimes tribunals held German military and political leaders to account for violations of the laws of war and crimes against humanity. The prosecutors argued correctly that following orders was not an excuse for committing atrocities. They established that individuals, including soldiers, had a moral and legal obligation to refuse unlawful orders. They rejected the defense that the extreme circumstances of war justified violations of basic human rights. These were the principles the Allies claimed to stand for. Yet when American soldiers violated those same principles, the response was to cover it up. This double standard has been used by critics of the United States for decades. Soviet propagandists during the Cold War pointed to incidents like Biscari and Dachau to argue that American claims of moral superiority were hypocritical. Modern critics make similar arguments. The counter-argument, that the scale and systematic nature of Axis atrocities were orders of magnitude worse than anything the Allies did, is valid, but does not entirely answer the criticism. The question is not whether American war crimes were equivalent to Nazi war crimes. They obviously were not, but whether the United States lived up to its own stated principles, and whether it held its own forces accountable when they failed to do so. The impact on international law and norms has been complex. On one hand, the United States played a leading role in establishing the modern framework of international humanitarian law after World War II. The Geneva Conventions were revised and expanded. The concept of universal jurisdiction for war crimes was strengthened. International tribunals became a tool for seeking justice. On the other hand, the American tendency to cover up or minimize its own violations has weakened the credibility of these efforts. It has made it easier for other nations to dismiss American criticisms of their human rights records. It has contributed to a perception that international law applies differently to powerful nations than to weak ones. For the veterans who participated in or witnessed to killings, the psychological burden has been heavy. Many suffered from what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though in their era it was called shell shock or combat fatigue, or simply not discussed. The images of Dachau, the railway cars full of corpses, the skeletal prisoners, the executions, these haunted them. Some turned to alcohol or struggled with relationships. Others became advocates for peace or for human rights, trying to ensure that nothing like the Holocaust could happen again. A few spoke publicly about what they had done, seeking some form of absolution or simply wanting the truth to be known. Most took their secrets to the grave. The liberated prisoners of Dachau and other camps had their own complex feelings about what happened. For many, the revenge killings were a minor footnote to their own suffering. They had survived a genocide. Whether some of their guards were executed on Liberation Day or later at trials was not their primary concern. They wanted to rebuild their lives, to find surviving family members, to bear witness to what had happened. Some testified at war crimes trials. Others emigrated to new countries and tried to forget. The trauma of the camps shaped their lives forever. The liberation, violent as it may have been in some aspects, was still liberation. It was the end of a nightmare, the moment they had fought to survive to see. The historical documentation of these events has improved significantly in recent decades. The declassification of military records, the publication of memoirs and academic research have filled in many gaps. Oral history projects have recorded the testimony of veterans and survivors before they passed away. Archives in the United States, Germany, and Israel have been searched for relevant documents. What has emerged is a more complete, more honest picture of the liberation of the camps and the violence that sometimes accompanied it. This history is uncomfortable, but it is more truthful than the sanitized versions that dominated for decades. The question of whether the soldiers should have been prosecuted remains contentious. Legal scholars generally agree that the killings violated the laws of war and that prosecution was legally justified. Ethicists are more divided. Some argue that the SS guards had forfeited moral consideration through their participation in genocide. Others maintain that the rule of law must apply equally to all, that exceptions lead down a dangerous path. Veterans and military historians often emphasize the extreme circumstances and the psychological state of the soldiers. They argue that prosecution would have been unjust, given what the soldiers had just witnessed. There is no easy answer that satisfies all perspectives. What is clear is that the cover-up itself was wrong. Even if one accepts that prosecution might have been inappropriate, given the circumstances, the decision to hide what happened, to classify reports, to prevent the truth from emerging, was a failure of leadership and accountability. It sent the message that some truths are too inconvenient to acknowledge. It prevented a full reckoning with what happened and why. It meant that lessons that should have been learned were not, and it contributed to a pattern of institutional cover-ups that would recur in future conflicts. The role of senior commanders, particularly General Patton in the Biscari case, deserves scrutiny. Patton was a brilliant tactician and a charismatic leader. He was also reckless, profane, and sometimes insubordinate. His speeches to troops before Sicily emphasized killing the enemy without mercy. Multiple witnesses testified that he had said things that could be interpreted as encouragement to take no prisoners. Whether he explicitly ordered the killing of prisoners is unclear, but he certainly created an atmosphere where such killings seemed acceptable, that he faced no consequences for this, that his career continued without serious interruption, demonstrated that the military was more interested in protecting successful commanders than in enforcing the laws of war. The institutional memory of these incidents within the military has been spotty. Some units have acknowledged them as part of their history, using them as teaching tools for what not to do. Others have ignored or denied them. The official histories have gradually become more honest, but many popular accounts and media portrayals still omit these details. The result is a general public that is largely unaware that these incidents occurred, that believes the liberation of the camps was entirely heroic, with no dark shadows. This incomplete history does a disservice to everyone. It prevents a full understanding of the complexities and moral challenges of war. It creates unrealistic expectations of how soldiers will behave under extreme stress. And it makes it easier for future cover-ups to occur, because there is no institutional memory of past failures. The comparison to other Allied forces is instructive. British, Canadian, and other Allied troops also liberated camps and also sometimes killed prisoners. The Soviets, whose forces liberated Auschwitz and other camps in the East, engaged in widespread violence against German prisoners and civilians. The difference is in how these incidents were handled institutionally. The Western Allies at least investigated, and sometimes prosecuted. Even if the prosecutions were half-hearted, the Soviets made no pretense of following the Geneva Conventions in their treatment of German prisoners. Hundreds of thousands of German POWs died in Soviet captivity, many from deliberate mistreatment. The Americans occupy a middle ground, claiming to follow the rules but bending them when convenient and covering up violations when they occurred. The moral injury suffered by soldiers who participated in or witnessed these events is a concept that has only recently gained recognition. Moral injury occurs when someone violates their deeply held moral beliefs or witnesses others doing so. It is distinct from but often accompanies PTSD. Soldiers at Dachau experienced moral injury in multiple ways. They witnessed the ultimate evil in the camp's atrocities. They participated in or witnessed revenge killings that violated their own values. They were then told to keep silent, to bury the truth. This triple trauma, the horror witnessed, the violence participated in, and the betrayal by the institution that demanded silence, left lasting scars. Only now, decades later, is the mental health profession beginning to understand and treat moral injury. For the World War II veterans, this understanding came too late. The impact on military justice and discipline going forward has been mixed. The military learned from Biscari and Dachau that some degree of accountability is necessary to maintain discipline and legitimacy. Later conflicts saw more vigorous prosecution of war crimes, though still often focused on lower-ranking individuals rather than the chain of command. The My Lai massacre in Vietnam resulted in courts-martial, though only Lieutenant William Calley was convicted and he served minimal time. The Abu Ghraib abuses led to prosecutions of enlisted soldiers and some officers, though senior leadership escaped accountability. The pattern established at Biscari and Dachau, investigate but protect the institution, has persisted. The revelation of these incidents has also affected how the military trains soldiers for dealing with atrocities. Modern training includes scenarios where soldiers discover evidence of war crimes or crimes against humanity. They are taught that the laws of war still apply, that prisoners must be protected even if they have committed heinous acts, that summary execution is never acceptable. Whether this training would hold up under the extreme stress of discovering something like Dachau is impossible to know without, thankfully, the circumstances to test it. But the military has recognized that soldiers need explicit guidance and support to do the right thing in such situations. The families of the soldiers involved have also been affected. Some veterans told their families what happened, burdening their children and spouses with the knowledge. Others kept silent, but their families knew something was wrong, that the war had changed them in ways they would not discuss. When the stories finally emerged publicly, families had to grapple with the knowledge that their father or grandfather had killed prisoners. Some defended their relatives' actions. Others struggled with reconciling the man they knew with what he had done. Still others felt betrayed that they had been lied to for decades. The ripple effects of these events extend across generations. The question of reparations or acknowledgement has occasionally been raised. Should the United States formally acknowledge these killings and apologize? Should there be some form of compensation to the families of those killed, even though they were SS guards who may themselves have been war criminals? These questions have no clear answers and have generally been avoided. The passage of time has made them increasingly moot. The perpetrators are dead. The victims are dead. The witnesses are nearly all gone. What remains is the historical record and the lessons that might be learned. Those lessons are important. War brings out the worst in people as well as the best. Atrocities can be committed by anyone under the right, or rather wrong, circumstances. Institutions will protect themselves, sometimes at the expense of truth and justice. The laws of war exist not to be nice to the enemy, but to protect our own humanity. to prevent us from becoming what we fight against. When we violate those laws and cover up the violations, we lose something essential. We undermine the very principles we claim to defend. We make it harder to claim moral authority in the world, and we betray the ideals that so many fought and died for. The soldiers who liberated Dachau performed an essential and heroic service. They freed thousands of people from a death camp. They bore witness to the Holocaust. They helped bring an end to Nazi tyranny. These facts are not diminished by acknowledging that some of them also killed prisoners in revenge. Human beings are complex. They are capable of both heroism and atrocity, sometimes in the same day, sometimes in the same hour. Acknowledging the full truth, the dark alongside the light, gives us a more complete and more honest history. It makes us more clear-eyed about the nature of war and the challenges of maintaining our values under extreme duress. It helps us prepare for future challenges with a realistic understanding of human nature and institutional behavior. The cover-up by the military was not a conspiracy of evil men. It was a series of decisions by people who believed they were serving the greater good. They thought that protecting the reputation of the army, maintaining morale, and preserving the image of American forces as liberators was more important than prosecuting soldiers for killing SS guards. In the context of 1945, with the war still ongoing in the Pacific and the need to maintain public support, they may have believed this was the right choice. But it was wrong. It was wrong legally, morally, and pragmatically. It established a pattern of institutional cover-ups that would haunt the military for decades, and it denied the truth to the American people and to history. As we look back now, more than 75 years later, we can see these events with more clarity. We can acknowledge that American soldiers sometimes committed war crimes. We can recognize that the military covered up these crimes. We can understand the human factors that led to these violations without excusing them. We can honor the veterans who served and liberated the camps while also holding accountable the institution that failed in its duty to enforce the laws of war. These are not contradictory positions. They are the necessary components of an honest reckoning with a complex history. The story of American soldiers executing German prisoners and the military covering it up is not a story that makes anyone feel good, but it is a story that needs to be told, understood, and remembered.